James Earl Jones received numerous lifetime achievement honors, including the Honorary Academy Award, Kennedy Center Honors, and multiple tributes from theater and film institutions recognizing his contributions to American arts. These honors effectively canonized him as one of the greats of his era. Let's take a look back and remember James Earl Jones. James Earl Jones, a voice that echoes forever, a name that instantly brings to mind authority, warmth, and a voice that seems to vibrate in your chest. His sound alone could quiet a room, terrify rebels across the galaxy, or comfort a child watching a cartoon lion on a Sunday afternoon. Yet behind that legendary voice was a man who began life in near silence, struggling with a severe stutter, wrestling with racism in his own family, and fighting his way into an industry that rarely made space for black performers. This is the story of James Earl Jones, his childhood, his identity, the work that made him a cultural icon, the controversies that complicated his image, and the extraordinary legacy he left behind in both human memory and digital form. James Earl Jones was born on January 17, 1931, in Arkabutla, Mississippi, a tiny community in the rural South during the Jim Crow era. For those of us who didn't know, the Jim Crow era was a period in the southern United States from the late 19th century until the mid-20th century, marked by state and local laws that enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans. These Jim Crow laws mandated separation in public facilities like schools, transportation, and restrooms, based on the separate but equal doctrine established by the Supreme Court in 1896. Term originated from a derogatory minstrel show character. African Americans were systematically denied the right to vote through methods like poll taxes and selective application of literacy tests. Jim Crow was more than just laws. It was a comprehensive system of racial hierarchy and white supremacy that also involved violence and terror from vigilantes to maintain the status quo. I digress. His father, Robert Earl Jones, was a boxer and actor who left the family when James was an infant, effectively disappearing from his early life. As a child, James was moved north and raised primarily by his maternal grandparents on a farm in Michigan, where life was marked by hard work, isolation, and the racial tensions of the time. Somewhere between the trauma of leaving the South and the adjustment to life in the Midwest, James developed a severe stutter that became so crippling he described himself as almost completely mute for years. Teachers and classmates saw a boy who rarely spoke, and some assumed he simply could not communicate. James later recalled that people sometimes thought he was slow, when in reality he was trapped behind a wall of blocked words and fear of humiliation. The teacher who found his voice. Everything began to change because of one teacher, Donald Crouch, an English teacher who refused to accept James's silence as permanent. Crouch noticed that Jones was strong on the page. His writing showed intelligence and sensitivity, and he suspected there was more hiding behind that quiet exterior. Crouch challenged James to read his own poetry aloud in class. The idea was terrifying, but under that pressure, and with a teacher who refused to mock or baby him, James pushed through line after line. The speech wasn't perfect, but the ice broke. Over time, that exercise, returning to the written word and forcing sound into the open, slowly unlocked his voice. Jones later credited that experience with changing his life, turning him from a boy functionally mute into a young man with a powerful, resonant delivery that would one day become famous worldwide. For many people who stutter, his story became a beacon, proof that a speech disorder does not have to define or limit a life. Education, identity, and the Army. After high school, Jones attended the University of Michigan. At first, he leaned toward medicine and other practical paths, but he gravitated more and more toward drama. debating whether a young black man from a farm could actually make a living as an actor. The university theater community gave him a new kind of stage, a place to test that newly recovered voice and to wrestle with characters larger than life. His education was interrupted by military service. In 1953, after the Korean War armistice, Jones was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army and later promoted to first lieutenant. He served primarily in the United States, helping to establish and lead a cold weather training program in Colorado, rather than serving as a doctor or medical officer in combat. Those years in uniform gave him discipline, leadership experience, and a sense of responsibility that would later inform many of his roles, especially authority figures and leaders. When he left the Army in the mid-1950s, he committed fully to acting, a risky move for a black veteran in an industry that still treated black performers as background decoration. James Earl Jones did not become a legend overnight. After the Army, he took on the unglamorous work of the theater, small roles, understudy parts, and long days on stages that could barely pay the bills. He spent time working in New York, including at the historic New York Shakespeare Festival, where he developed a reputation as a serious classical actor long before Hollywood cared about him. On stage, his height, standing at over 6 feet tall, his physical presence and booming voice set him apart, but he still had to fight the stereotype that black actors could only play limited, one-note roles. This early period toughened him. He learned to project not just volume, but emotional weight, turning every line into something that felt carved in stone. Jones's true breakthrough came with The Great White Hope, a play inspired by the life of black heavyweight champion Jack Johnson. In the late 1960s, at a time when the civil rights movement was reshaping American life, this story of a black boxer persecuted for daring to love across racial lines hit like a thunderclap. Jones's performance as Jack Jefferson was raw, powerful, and deeply human. More than a symbol, he was a fully realized man. The role earned him a Tony Award for Best Actor in 1969, and when the play was adapted for film in 1970, he received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Suddenly, he was not just a respected stage performer. He was a symbol of what black actors could do in major, complex lead roles. At a time when Hollywood still routinely sidelined or stereotyped black talent, James Earl Jones proved that a black actor could carry a major production spiritually, emotionally, and commercially. The Great White Hope was not just a personal breakthrough. It was a cultural statement, building a towering career, stage, screen, and television. Jones pictured here from a photo by Bob Gaumont with Muhammad Ali, after a performance of The Great White Hope at the Alvin Theater back in 1968. Over the next several decades, Jones built one of the most formidable resumes in American entertainment. On Broadway, he became a towering presence, acclaimed for roles in classical works and contemporary dramas alike. Many don't know that James Earl Jones was the very first celebrity guest on Sesame Street in 1969, and his appearance became historic. He recited the alphabet slowly and deliberately, without cue cards, marking a groundbreaking moment for the new children's show. His unique, resonant voice and steady pace were so effective in teaching children that it became a recognized teaching technique for the show.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z.
In 1978, he returned to Sesame Street for episode 1148, visiting Hooper's store to learn about being a movie star. interacting with characters like Big Bird and Mr. Hooper. It featured him as a visiting actor, enjoying Mr. Hooper's egg creams, a memorable segment highlighting repetition and interactive learning, demonstrating the famous James Earl Jones effect with his deep voice. And he even arrived in a limousine, a fun moment for Big Bird after he had imagined Jones arrived in a limo, only for Jones to actually return for another egg cream, and Big Bird taking a joyride in the limo. He made several more appearances on the show, returning for various memorable spots, including hosting a 10th anniversary special in 1979 and appearing in segments through the years, showing his consistent contribution to the show's educational impact. He was already famous as Darth Vader by then, and his appearances, starring as the very first guest in 1969, cemented his legacy with the show. Jones's simple, powerful contributions helped shape Sesame Street's groundbreaking approach to educational television, paving the way for many other stars. He won additional Tony Awards, including one for his performance in August Wilson's Fences in 1987, where he played Troy Maxson, a former African-American League baseball player haunted by lost opportunities. On film, he appeared in an array of memorable projects, from Coming to America and its sequel, Coming to America 2, to Field of Dreams, Patriot Games, Clear and Present Danger, and many more. Even when he wasn't the main character, his presence anchored scenes with gravitas and warmth. On television, Jones earned multiple Emmys for roles in works like Gabriel's Fire and Heat Wave, and he appeared in a wide variety of dramatic and comedic projects. Across stage, film, and TV, he collected Emmys, a Grammys, several Tonys, and ultimately an honorary Academy Award, recognizing his lifetime contribution to film, a combination that has led many to describe him as having EGOT-level status, even as award purists debate whether an honorary Oscar counts as a true EGOT. In case you didn't know, EGOT is an acronym for an entertainer who has won all 4 major American awards: an Emmy for television, Grammy for music, Oscar for film, and Tony for theater. It's considered the grand slam of show business, signifying mastery across major performing arts, with only a select few, like Jennifer Hudson, Viola Davis, John Legend, Rita Moreno, and Elton John, achieving this rare feat. In 1977, when George Lucas released the first Star Wars film, the physical performance of Darth Vader came from actor David Prowse, but the soul of the character, the terrifying calm and deep menace, came from Jones's voice work. Of course, for millions of people, James Earl Jones will always be 2 voices, Darth Vader and Mufasa. James Earl Jones recorded the original lines for Darth Vader in a relatively short session and was paid around $7,000 for his work, a modest fee for a role that would become one of the most iconic in cinema history. He was not even credited originally in the same way one might expect today. Decades later, as Star Wars grew into a multi-billion-dollar franchise, fans and commentators would look back at that fee as an example of how voice actors and black performers were undervalued at the time. In 1994, he took on a very different kind of father figure, Mufasa in Disney's The Lion King. Compassion and strength shaping childhoods around the world. Here, his voice embodied wisdom. For a generation of kids, he was the voice that taught them about responsibility, courage, and the circle of life, not as a meme, but as a real emotional anchor in their first movie-going experiences. A distinctive sound beyond fiction. Outside of films, James Earl Jones's voice became a cultural fixture in everyday life. He was famously heard in the tagline, "This is CNN," giving a news channel a sense of seriousness and authority that fit the cable news boom of the late 20th century. He narrated countless commercials, documentaries, and special programs, turning what had once been his greatest weakness, his speech, into one of the most recognizable voices on earth. This work also contributed significantly to his wealth over time. While he started with low-paying roles, later decades saw him commanding much higher fees for narration, commercial work, and recurring projects, reflecting the growing recognition of his unique vocal presence, personal life, love, and loss. Behind the professional triumphs, James Earl Jones experienced a personal life marked by both joy and heartbreak. He married actress Julianne Marie in 1968, but the marriage ended in divorce in the early 1970s. In 1982, he married actress Cecilia Hart, forming a long-lasting partnership that friends and colleagues often described as warm and supportive. Together, Jones and Hart had one son, Flynn Earl Jones. Flynn has worked as a narrator and audiobook voice actor in his own right, continuing the family's connection to storytelling and voice work. Cecilia Hart died in 2016, leaving James widowed after more than 3 decades together, a loss that deeply affected him in his later years. At the time of his death, financial outlets and obituaries estimated James Earl Jones's net worth at around $40 million, the result of decades of steady work on stage, in film, and in voiceover, plus residuals, commercial work, and honors that came late but came strongly. His financial journey echoed the broader story of many black artists in Hollywood, initially underpaid and underestimated, later recognized as foundational to the culture. Controversies, contradictions, and hard truths. Like many long-lived public figures, James Earl Jones was not free of controversy. In the years leading up to and following his death, writers and commentators revisited older interviews and public appearances highlighting comments that many saw as disparaging toward black women and reflective of misogynoir, a form of prejudice at the intersection of racism and sexism. These resurfaced clips and critiques led to online backlash and uncomfortable conversations about how even barrier-breaking black male icons can participate in harmful stereotypes about black women. Jones also spoke openly about being taught racism within his own family, particularly by his grandmother. He described how she held deeply racist views and how he had to consciously unlearn some of the attitudes he absorbed in that environment, even as a black man himself. This complexity, a black actor raised by a relative with intense prejudice, gave him a unique vantage point on how racism is transmitted and how it must be confronted within families, not just in public policy. At the same time, he publicly criticized racism in American society and politics, including calling out the Tea Party movement as racist in a widely reported interview. That led to backlash from conservative commentators and reinforced his image as someone unafraid to speak bluntly about race, even if his own record and comments were messy and sometimes contradictory. Standing against blackface and industry racism, in addition to his broader comments on racism, Jones was critical of blackface and the long history of racist caricature in American entertainment. Coming from a generation that directly followed the era of minstrel shows, he knew how damaging these images were and how they boxed black performers into degrading portrayals. He used his career to push for richer, more complex black characters in theater and film. Roles like Jack Jefferson in The Great White Hope and Troy in Fences were not just artistic achievements. They were statements that black life, pain, and joy deserved the same dramatic weight as any other subject on stage. As James Earl Jones grew older, his on-screen appearances became less frequent, but he continued to act and make special appearances well into his 80s and 90s. He reprised his role as King Jaffe Joffer in Coming to America in 2021, a nostalgic return to a beloved character that allowed fans to see him once more as a regal, commanding figure. He received numerous Lifetime Achievement honors, including the Honorary Academy Award, Kennedy Center honors, and multiple tributes from theater and film institutions recognizing his contributions to American arts. These honors effectively canonized him as one of the greats of his era. One of the most fascinating parts of his later years was his decision to allow his Darth Vader voice to live on through technology. For the Disney Plus series Obi-Wan Kenobi, Lucasfilms worked with the Ukrainian company Respeecher to create an AI-assisted version of Darth Vader's voice based on recordings of Jones. Reports indicated that Jones agreed to sign over certain rights so his voice could be recreated synthetically for future projects, turning him into one of the first major actors whose signature sound was formally preserved in this way. This move sparked debate. Some saw it as a powerful way to preserve a legendary voice and maintain continuity for fans. Others worried about what AI voice replication means for performers. Control over their own identities, especially when they are older, vulnerable, or no longer alive to consent. In the case of James Earl Jones, it became part of his digital legacy, ensuring that the heavy breathing and commanding tone of Darth Vader would continue to bear his sonic fingerprint even when he was gone. The death of James Earl Jones and the global tributes that followed. On September the 9th, 2024, James Earl Jones died at his home in Paulding, New York, at the age of 93. His agent confirmed the news, noting that he passed surrounded by loved ones, closing a chapter on one of the most significant acting careers of the last century. The reaction was immediate and worldwide. Media outlets across the globe ran retrospectives celebrating his work and his voice. Former co-stars and collaborators spoke about his generosity on set, his discipline, and the almost physical impact of hearing him speak in person. Fans shared clips of Darth Vader, Mufasa, and Troy Maxson, telling stories of how his characters shaped their childhoods, their sense of justice, or their understanding of fatherhood. Broadway honored him in the traditional way, by dimming its lights, a gesture reserved for towering figures in theater. In many tributes, he was described as a bridge between classic stage acting and modern pop culture, a man who could do Shakespeare one night and voice a cartoon line the next, without ever losing his sense of dignity. James Earl Jones's legacy. From a mute child to immortal voice. His life can be seen as a journey from enforced silence to an almost mythic voice that now exists both in memory and in data. As a boy, he could barely get words out. And as a man, he delivered some of the most quoted lines in film history and stood at the center of multiple iconic roles. That transformation, from stutter and shame to power and clarity, is the core of his story.
No, I am your father.
He leaves behind his son, Flynn Earl Jones, who continues the family connection to storytelling, as well as a body of work that stretches across theater, film, television, and voiceover. He also leaves behind uncomfortable questions about how black performers were paid and treated in earlier decades, about how gender and race intersected in his own comments, and about how technology will use and reuse human voices in the future. Yet for many people, one simple truth remains. Every time Darth Vader speaks, every time Mufasa's words echo through a new remaster of The Lion King, a piece of James Earl Jones is still with us. The boy who once thought he might never speak became the man whose voice will echo, through film, through AI, and through memory, for generations to come. Thank you for taking the time to watch. If you enjoyed this deep dive of James Earl Jones, please throw me a thumb. And if you want to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. Hope to see y'all in the next one.